So we've been doing this breathing room series, and we've been talking about how hard it is and difficult it is to find some breathing room, and then you lost an hour last night. And so you're just like giving up, and I was convinced that the people that did show up at 9:30 today, they're just trying to earn their way into heaven and whatever, they can figure that out on their own, but you guys live under grace. We were like, no, the people that live under grace won't be at Epic at all today. They'll blame it on the rain and the loss of losing an hour of sleep. Mary just gave all the details about Easter, so I'm not going to repeat that, but just pastorally, I want to say to you, guys, this is a chance for us to lean in and to seize opportunities that literally aren't afforded to our church community any other time of the year. If you've been in the church for a long, especially outside of San Francisco, you know that Easter and Christmas are kind of the two times that you see an enormous, kind of double the attendance sort of gatherings, but Easter is the only one for us because at Christmas, you all leave. Okay? And so San Francisco, literally, of all my church friends around the nation, San Francisco is one of the most unique places in terms of Christmas. There's not this amazing opportunity to reach new people at Christmas. So this is our kind of one chance where you heard from Mary, 1,000 or so people will participate in the events that week, especially on that Sunday, and we want to be ready. And so just as your pastor, I want to ask you to lean in, seize these opportunities, and let's figure out how God might use us in what he wants to do over this Easter 2016. We've been in this breathing room series, and if you've not been here at all in the series so far, let me encourage you to go back and listen to what we've been talking about. We've been saying in this breathing room is a space that exists between our load and our limits, and we've really been talking about our calendars and our priorities and how to participate in the Sabbath. Was the last couple of weeks that's what we talked about. But today, what I want to do is talk about financial breathing room. And if you thought it was hard to find calendar breathing room, right? Some of you are like, Ben, I can find calendar breathing space before I can find financial breathing room. So financial breathing room, I've been told it is a thing. I haven't experienced it, but I've been told it's a thing. Financial margin's another phrase that I will use interchangeably with financial breathing room. And so that's what I'm talking about today. Remember, everything we've been saying principle-wise in the breathing room series, it applies to whatever the category is. It might take on some different words, but everything we've been saying about how we deal with our calendar and our time and our priorities, when it comes to financial breathing room, the same principles still apply. So when we think about space between our load and our limits, while we're talking finances, here's how we want to kind of interchange the words here. When we think about limits, this is just total income through whatever sources. You're a lottery player, you're rolling dice in your apartment building in the community room, whatever you're babysitting, like whatever you're doing, so all total income sources. And then load is just our spending. Okay? And so you've got, rather than limit, we've got income, and rather than load, we're just using spending here. And every one of us in this room, we are one of three places relative to our level of income. With our expenses, we are below it. I guess some of you are below it. You could be right at it, or you could be over that line of your level of income. Now, when we realize that all of us are in one of those three places, we think that we know why we are in the place we're in, right? It has everything to do with our level of come on, class. I know it's an hour, but you're 11 o'clock. We think that it has everything to do with our level of income. Now, let me make this statement. In situations where there's extreme poverty or extreme wealth, there can be a direct correlation to financial margin. Okay, so I'm saying there are some outliers that are going against, but for the most of us, our financial margin or the lack thereof really doesn't have as much to do with our financial income as you think it does. It really doesn't. But we think that, the reason I am where I am is because I don't have enough, right? No, it's just because you spent more than you made, right? And so it's a math thing for most of us. So the one reason we think the financial margin reality in our life is due to our level of income. It's not usually the case, actually. The second thing we think is it's the fact that we live in San Francisco. Anybody? Anybody besides me started a conversation with, if I lived in such and such place, do you know how big my house would be? What schools my kids could go to? I would have grass. If I lived somewhere else, right? So pick your spot, right? Some of you are and here's the thing, if you want to do that, go for it, but then you will live someplace else. So yeah, if you want a mansion in Iowa, right? 2-story deal in South Carolina, you want a 3-car garage in Dallas. You can have this, but then you'll live there. Not hating on those places, all right? Not hating at all. I'm just saying, yeah, you could have it, but then you would live there. And so I do want to say, with the reality of living in San Francisco, there is some truth to our financial margin situation being affected. Let me say that there is some truth to that. But it's not a one-to-one correlation, okay? I know people in San Francisco who are poor and have margin and who used to be millionaires or bankrupt now. And I know people in San Francisco, in each of your neighborhoods, we could find some people, I promise you, that are living here, living here and living here, and they could be making the same amount of money you are, but they're different on the scale than you are. Does that make sense? Now, here's the thing. If I were to say to you today, what are all the practical reasons we should pursue financial margin in our lives? There would be a list of reasons, right? Security, comfort, dial down the stress and anxiety a little bit, to be prepared for emergencies. And I'm all for practical reasons. There are some great practical books out there in the secular stream and in the Christian stream. And practically, there are people here at Epic, actually, that can help you in the practical sense. But we are not a community of people trying to orient our lives around what's practical, though that can be good. We are, come on class, a community of people trying to orient our entire lives around Jesus. Okay? And so we aren't asking, hey, what's practical? That's what we want to give ourselves to. That can be helpful. But we are the kind of people who are wanting to orient our lives around Jesus. And here's why that's our vision statement, if you're not clued in. The reason that's our vision statement is because we know that Jesus wants to speak into every facet and area and sphere of our lives. And if you know anything about what he has to say dealing with things like treasure and finances and possessions, he says more about this area than mostly any other area. It's kind of crazy. He talked about it a lot more than I'm comfortable talking about it from this stage. But it's necessary if we're going to follow Jesus. So here's the question we have to ask. What does financial margin have to do with orienting our lives around Jesus? What does financial margin, we understand the practical implications, but that's not our primary question this morning. So what does financial margin have to do with orienting our entire lives around Jesus? Two primary things, and then we'll get into the specific answers. The first thing is that there's something that comes from following Jesus that creates financial margin. We'll unlock that in a moment. And then because we're orienting our lives around Jesus, he wants to inform what we do with our financial margin. Okay? So it's going to produce financial margin. I'm going to show you how orienting your life around Jesus can produce it. Again, there are outlier cases, there are economic situations, there's unemployment, there's bills that are just crazy, people paying for college, like there are outlier situations. But primarily for most of us, there's a way that following Jesus should produce a particular thing in us that leads to financial margin. And as we orient and follow Jesus, our lives around Jesus and follow him, he should inform what it is that we do with it. So our central text for today is found in 1 Timothy chapter 6. If you have a Bible, if you need a Bible, just raise your hand. We'll get one to you. We'll have page number on the screen, 644. Timothy's, there's 1st and 2nd Timothy towards the back half of your Bible. Never be afraid to use table of contents here at Epic. Would rather you end up on the right page and have figured out how to get there. And besides, I know what I'm teaching this morning, so I'm already there. I'm like a wide receiver that knows what route he's running, but you've got to defend me. You need to catch up and cover, right? So 1 Timothy chapter 6, page 644 in the Bibles we just handed out. And I want to ask you to stand as we look at this. Let me give you a little bit of background and context. Timothy, at this time, is a young man in the ministry. He's leading a church. And Paul, that many of us know, wrote 13 letters in the New Testament. Paul serves as a mentor to Timothy. Timothy's known as a pastoral epistle. So here's what Paul is doing. He's talking to Timothy about how to lead his church. So understand, he's writing to Timothy, but he's telling Timothy what to tell the church. And when chapter 6 begins, Paul says, be careful about false doctrines out there. And he says, there are some people in your church that are only a part of the faith for their own financial gain. Okay? And here's in verse 6 through 10 where Paul writes to us, I think, everything that has to do with financial margin and how we get there. Paul says, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. Yes, Paul, that's all it takes. But let me tell you what kind of food. And let me tell you what kind of clothing. Anybody else convicted? Like, that's all I have on my list. Anybody else? Just food and clothing. I don't need anything else. Ben? Verses 9 and 10. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. You may be seated. I think one of the things I just feel a prompting to say right off the bat here is when you read what the scriptures teach about wealth and the desire of riches, doesn't it make you sick that there are people who say that they're preaching the word of God on TV in churches around the world saying that, hey, here's a way to get rich, here's a get-rich scheme when it comes to faith, and yet the scripture speaks so against that. So if you've been, I didn't say that at 9:30. If you've been a part of a church or you grew up under some teachings where like, hey, God's big goal for your life is for you to be wealthy and just to go for that wealth, you've been led astray. So I just want to get, I just know that there's a lot of teaching out there. If that's you, you've just been led astray. And so we want to dial into what the scriptures actually teach this morning. So Paul wants to give us the keystone habit for financial margin as followers of Jesus. If you are not a follower of Jesus, or at least not yet, we just want you to hear who he is and why he directs us to live in certain ways. Just to eavesdrop in on the conversation we're having today as we try to orient our lives around Jesus. So often we think that gain is getting more and more and more or having more and more and more money, right? And one of the things you see Paul doing, and Jesus does this brilliantly, is they take terms from the secular mindset in terms of financial wealth and they redefine those terms. Do you see that in the text? So Paul's talking about this idea of riches, he redefines it. He redefines how we think of profit. He redefines how we think of the word gain. Jesus does this using the word treasure. Are you familiar with this? A number of times Jesus uses the word treasure. So what they've done, they're just brilliant communicators, first of all. And they're trying to get people in the church to understand what really wealth is, what riches really are, what gain is. And so Paul says, hey, gain, Timothy, you need to tell your people, gain is not just them getting more stuff and more money. True gain is them being godly and learning contentment. Godliness simply means this: your life increasingly looking like God's life. Your character increasingly looking like God's. And if you're like me, one of the things I love about our church and the way that God deals with us completely as his children is it's a process. So none of us are waking up today and God's going, hey, I want you to get this all right today. Remember, our vision statement is to orient our entire lives around Jesus. And the reason that's our vision statement is because I don't think there will be a day on this earth when any of us get it down perfectly. Right? There's no like gold stars we're passing out at Epic. You made it. You oriented your entire life and you never wavered from it. It's a process, but it's a process that should be about progress, right? And so Paul says, here's what great gain is. If you want to know what you should be striving for, become more and more like Jesus as you mature in your faith and in spiritual growth. And then he says, you need to learn contentment. And so contentment is the thing we're answering that first question from today. Contentment is the keystone habit that creates financial margin for most Christians. I say most Christians because if you're in an unemployed situation, if you're in a crisis, you could be absolutely following Jesus with everything you have, and the circumstances just have so far not been benefited you in a way that you can have any margin. So you're not bad for that. It's just there are circumstances and individuals, those, I think for the most part, in this room at least, those are outlying situations. So Paul says, godliness with contentment is great gain. This is gain, actually being content and living a life that looks more and more like the life of Jesus. And then he says, just so you know, if you say that you have to have this or that to be content, when you came into the world, you didn't have any this or that. Everybody knows how they came in, right? Got no visuals to show this morning, but everybody knows how they entered the scene. He says, in the same manner in which you entered the scene of earth, you're going to exit the scene of earth in the same manner. And so if you say, I have to have this or that, there are only a couple of things that are going to last forever. So you better make sure those things are on your this or that list. That's what he's getting to the heart of. And then he gets to what has been, and you guys are like, oh, Ben, this is going to be one of those sermons. Listen, I've had it all week, okay? I'm with you. Like, just Shauna and I needed to have some conversations last night so that I could get up and preach with a little bit of integrity this morning. Threatened to cut the kids' cable right in the middle of their favorite cartoon, but I haven't done that. Yet. But it's like, okay, Shauna, we've got to do some things different ourselves, and just want to be open and honest about that. So I'm with you. So when he says, with food and clothing, with these we will be content, I'm like, me too, Paul. Me too. With food and clothing, with these we will be content. Now, I will take some comfort and try to give you some comfort in terms of this contentment process. Paul says in Philippians 4:11 that he had to learn it. Here's what he says when he's saying he knew what it was like to have much and he knew what it was like to have very little. Listen to what he says. He says, not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. if there's any comfort from this verse, it should be that Paul was able to learn it. Paul, the amazing man that he was, it didn't come automatic for him. He didn't wake up one day when he didn't have what he needed to have or what he thought he needed to have in life and just go, I'm so content. Just take more from me, God. He says, I have learned it. I have learned it. And so we're in this process of learning as we follow Jesus and as we think about it. What we're doing with contentment is this. We're really analyzing what is on our I must have that list and what isn't. And here's what you need to know. This passage is not about a lot of money equals bad at all. This passage isn't about that at all. And it's not about you can't have more than whatever's on your contentment list. Most of us in this room, God has given, and my guess is will continue to give us even more than what we have to have. Does that make sense? But he's saying you need to be honest about what is on your I must have that list. So let me ask you this question. What is enough for you? Don't answer out loud. But be honest with yourself. What is enough for you? And we started this series. You remember we looked at the encounter Jesus had with Martha and Mary? Everybody's like, no, Ben, that was a month ago. We don't remember what you said last week. All right, my confidence is high. With Martha and Mary, Jesus comes to their home. Two sisters. Martha's busy in the kitchen. Mary's taking the posture of a disciple, kneeling down before Jesus as he teaches. And Martha's like, Jesus, don't you care that my sister's leaving me to do all the work? And we said both of those two women have an I can't miss this list. Do you remember that? Ring a bell? Thank you. I can't miss this. And we said not only do those two women have an I can't miss this list that led them to do their two different things, very different things, but every one of us and everyone in the whole world has an I can't miss this list. And most of us, we said, with the breathing room series, is we have no breathing room because we have way too many things on our I can't miss this list. Well, when it comes to contentment, every single one of us has an I must have this list. Every one of us in this room has an I must have this list. Now, with this list, again, I want to say, it doesn't mean God won't give us more than what we consider to be enough. I think oftentimes and usually, at least in this country and in this congregation, most of the time he does. But you need to be honest about what is on your I must have this list. Food, clothing, those are just a given, right? Ben, why would I put that on the list? I've had that all my life. Not everybody has. But what else is on the list? What neighborhood do you have to live in? How much square footage do you have to have? What kind of car do you have to drive, and how often do you have to trade it in? What kind of restaurant do you have to eat at, and how frequent? Nothing against bad restaurants, thankfully. But if you have to have certain things in terms of your own contentment, you just need to be honest. And it won't help you or me at all to lie to ourselves about what we need to be content, okay? One of the worst things we can do is give the sort of expected church or Jesus answer. Just be honest. Like, what do you need to be content? For me, if I can just be honest and sort of set the tone, it doesn't stop with food and clothing. But you're the pastor. I got a lot more on my list. Not saying I don't need to work through that, but I have more on my list than food and clothing. I do. And my guess is that most of us do. So just what is on your list? It's just helpful to know that. And then Paul has some really big warnings in verses 9 and 10. Look at verses 9 and 10. Verse 9 and 10 is for anyone. He talks about that have the love or desire or crave riches, but here's who he's talking about. People who never have come on, friends, enough. People who are never content. So he's not talking about rich people. He's talking about people that always have a level at which they have to get to, and they're never at the level that makes them content. Know anybody like that? Here's what he says. Those who desire to be rich, not who are rich, who desire to be rich, fall into temptation, into a trap or a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. The love of money, not money, the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. And he said it is through this craving, this desiring, this loving to be more, or to be richer than you are today, it is through those cravings that many people, some people at least, have even walked away from their faith. So it doesn't say there's anything wrong with you having much wealth, but if that's what your heart is set on, it always leads to ruin and destruction. And we've seen this, right? How so? Because if that's what your heart is set on, you'll do whatever you have to do to get that. You'll be unethical at the office if that's what gets you the bonus or the promotion, right? You'll do things with your taxes. Pastor, move on. All right. And so we just need to be honest. What is it that we're after? What is it that we are craving? And Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 5:10, same kind of thing. He says, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. And some of us are like, I would love to try, Ben. I would love to see if $500,000 might help me out a little bit. I think I could be satisfied. Anybody? I think I could find some satisfaction. But here's the deal with contentment. We always lie to ourselves about contentment. Do you know that? We're always lying to ourselves about contentment. This will be on the screen. If you're always thinking you'd be content with something you don't currently have, then you will never be content. Let me say it again. If you're always thinking, if I had something that I don't currently possess, then I will be content, you have no chance of ever being content. The same thing with Solomon, right? He said, whoever loves money will not be satisfied with his income. What is he saying? Let's get real practical. He's saying the person who's making $50,000 says to himself, if I can get to 75 or 100, then what? You guys remember what you were making coming out of college? Anybody? Just remember that number. And I know there's some outliers in here, but just remember your number. $25,000 was mine. And we were set until we weren't. Like, Ben, but you're old. They're doing it different these days. I didn't go to college, and I'm making $150 at a tech company as a 19-year-old. Awesome. But do you remember that number? But that number always changes. And if that number's always changing, or if those possessions are always changing, if you can't be content because there's something that you're currently missing, you probably will never be content. How else do you explain athletes that made $1 gazillion being bankrupt? 43 Ferraris wasn't enough, so I needed that 44th one. Really? Really? Whatever's on your I must have this list, you're going to set down other things because you've determined that you have to have that. But when we're not content, not only does it keep us from the financial margin we're talking about, a lack of contentment also is basically or essentially saying to God, God, you have not provided enough for me in this season. Like, Ben, that sounds harsh. I would never say that to God. That is what discontentment is screaming to God. And I'm guilty of it at times in my past, and so have you. It's going, God, you missed it, man. How am I going to get this if you don't increase? And so it's this discontentment. My favorite one-verse parable is in Matthew 13:44, related to an I must have that list. Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. All right, we just need to have a little bit of honest confession. Anybody ever found that one last sweater or one last jacket or one last pair of shoes in a store and covered it up? Anybody? Come on. Thank you. 9:30 was trying to be all Jesus-like, but I was like, no, not always. So he finds it and covers up, and the guy covers it up the same reason you cover up that last sweater. He doesn't want anybody else to get it. But then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Why does he sell everything he has? Because he's just like every human on the planet. He has an I must have that list. You have an I must have that list. And he doesn't care what he has to set down to get what he must have. Every one of us in this room are sacrificing one thing to have another. Does that make sense? Or we may be sacrificing many things to have one thing, or maybe sacrificing one thing to have these smaller many things. Whatever the case may be, we all have an I must have that list, and it would just be really helpful if we could be honest about what's on our list. What we've been saying in this Breathing Room series is that we can't have it all, right? You can't have it all. You have to choose one thing. One of our favorite things to say around Epic, you can't love a gallon of ice cream a day and want to wear skinny jeans, right? The two just, you got to choose. Right? And you do not have, at least I'm guessing most of you do not have unlimited financial resources. Which means what? It means that you've got to determine what's enough, what's the value, what's the priority, and know that there are going to be some things that you don't get to get for the most of us. And so just being really clear with what that is. So contentment, for most of our situations, is the keystone habit that unlocks financial margin in our lives. Contentment creates financial margin. But some of us don't want to create financial margin through contentment. Some of us try to create financial margin through going around God's plan for our finances. Some of us think, oh man, I read about that giving stuff in the Bible. But do you know if I kept that 10% where I would be? And we try to create financial margin. Shauna and I have done this before. When we get our giving statement at the end of the year, we look at that thing. And it's not uncommon for me to say to her, do you know how we would be living if we weren't giving? I could rap. I got a couple rhymes. Give me a beat. Just kidding. God, just kidding. That's awesome. Now I'm blushing, which never happens here. I'm not. No, we're good. Stop it. They've got all the power back there. That is awesome. Only at Epic Church, 11 o'clock. That's why you'd never miss church. But Sean and I do. We're just like, can you imagine what we could do with that number of dollars where our kids could go to school in the city? Can you imagine the vacations we could take? Can you imagine? But then we're like, yeah, can you imagine living outside of God's strategy and blessing for our lives when it comes to our finances? Haven't we seen God take care of us? And all I want to say is this: in the kingdom of God, math doesn't work like it does always down at the bank. And I can't explain it. I'm just telling you, in the kingdom of God, there's a correlation. So Proverbs 11:24 spells out the counterintuitive correlation this way. Proverbs 11:24 says, one gives freely but grows all the richer. That doesn't make sense. Another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. Isn't that so counterintuitive? One gives freely. One's like, I'm in, God. And they actually grow in their wealth. Now, that might not always be financial wealth. I don't have amazing hair to promise you that, or any hair. And he says, one withholds what he should give, and he's the one who suffers want. Again, I don't know how the math works, always in God's kingdom. I can't explain it. I can't give it to you on a chart. I can't whiteboard it with you. I can't go, here's the formula. I just know this, that we can't try to create financial margin by going around God's plan for our finances. If our goal is to have a healthy financial situation in God's eyes, we can't disobey his commandments. Fair? Ben, move on. All right, I'm moving on. So contentment creates financial margin, but when we have that financial margin, should we ever experience it, what do we do with it? What are we supposed to do with it? Stay in 1 Timothy 6 with me. Verses 17 through 19 are going to inform us as followers of Jesus what we do with it. Here's what Paul writes to Timothy. As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. Do you see that play on words still? 18, they are to do good, there it is again, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. Thus storing up, there it is, treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. Do you see Paul redefining more words from the culture? It's really amazing, especially get to verse 19. After he's talking, be rich in good works, 19, he does it at least 3 times that I see. He says, storing up treasure. We think of treasure as stuff we can have now. He's like, no, it's store up treasure for later. He uses the phrase, a good foundation for the future. If your financial planner is telling you, hey, store up a good foundation for the future, what is he telling you? And this is good wisdom, not bad. He's saying what? Set aside, save, invest in your retirement account. Those are good things. But that's not what Paul means in this text, does he? Paul means your life on earth here is like a blip, it's like a whisper, it's like a vapor, but eternity is really long. That's why at Epic, one of our values is we leverage the temporary, the small thing, for the sake of what's eternal, right? We leverage the temporary for the sake of what is eternal. And so Paul's going, store up for yourselves. Now, in verse 17, most of us think we get off the hook when Paul says, for the rich in the present age. Anybody, like if I was like, hey, who's rich in this present age in San Francisco? Not many hands would go up in this room. Friends, we can't think relative to San Francisco. We need to think relative to the globe. Okay? All of a sudden, 99% of us are now in that first phrase, the rich in the present age. 99% of us are in the top 10% of wealthiest people in the world. It's probably more like top 5 or 6%. Okay? So we're all back in the verse. You're no longer excluded. Everybody happy? The rich in the present age. Most of us are in there. It says, as for the rich in the present age, tell them not to... So remember, Paul is telling Timothy how to pastor his church. It's really important to remember. And he's saying, tell the rich people in your congregation not to be haughty, which is this. Tell them not to be prideful. Prideful people who are wealthy assume that their wealth was generated by them alone. Help them to remember that God enabled them to earn that wealth. No matter how, you're like, oh, but they were smart. But yeah, who gave them the brain? I mean, wherever you go, right? That's our thing. You finally get back to God. Not to set their hopes on riches, but to set their hopes on God, who richly, play on words, provides them with everything to enjoy. If you set your hopes on God, contentment will come. If you set your hopes on riches, contentment will remain elusive. Set your hopes on God, Paul says, contentment will come. God richly provides us with what we need. Set your hopes on riches, contentment will always be out of reach. It's a good life lesson, even if you're not a spiritual person among us this morning. If it's always more and more and more, that just keeps jumping. So learn how to be content. And then Paul says, be generous and ready to share. That's verse 18. Do you know how you are generous and ready to share? By having some financial breathing room. Listen, if you want to share but have no financial breathing room, and sometimes this is the case for us because of how life works, you can't share even if you want to. But he's like, the way you position yourself, so contentment breeds financial margin, and financial margin prepares us to be generous and ready to share. See how it works? That's the whole idea behind this plan. The Hope Project here at Epic is a great example of financial margin. You guys have killed it over the last 4 of the last 5 years as a church. You have given way more than what the goal was for the Hope Project so we could bless our partners around the world and expand and extend our ministry. So we've had financial margin through the Hope Project. No, the staff did not get heavy bonuses out of that extra, okay? But it has allowed us, just like it can do in your personal life, it's allowed us to seize unforeseen opportunities. With financial margin from the Hope Project, let me give you just 3 of the things we've done so far. We helped a little 3-year-old girl at our partner church in Uganda have a heart transplant. A good seizing of an opportunity. We helped build a church structure in India for the home church of one of our leaders here at Epic. Good use of margin? Yeah. We were able to support 2 local missionaries who are serving at this service right now, who live in the Tenderloin, live on very little, and are pouring their lives into people in the Tenderloin. Good use of margin? The same is true in your personal lives, right? It allows us to seize opportunities. For me and Shauna, it allows us to say, hey, we set aside X amount of margin, and we want to bless. In addition to what we give to our church, we want to be blessing people and helping expand and extend ministry beyond just what we're doing in our own lives. Let me give you an Old Testament passage, just 2 verses from Leviticus. And if you know anything about Leviticus, no, I'm not going to give you some of those awkward verses. Leviticus 19, 9 and 10. This whole idea of financial margin shows up, and then we'll reinterpret it for modern times. God, through Moses, says to the Israelites, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. Now, I assume this doesn't correlate exactly. Anybody got vineyards? Just asking for a couple reasons. Anybody? Vineyards? All right. Nobody? Yeah, sorry. Just trying to get that pastor discount if somebody had a vineyard. Joking. So when it says, when you reap the harvest of your land, to interpret it in our times, that just means when you get a paycheck, okay? When you get a paycheck, when you reap the harvest of your land, when you get a paycheck, monthly, every couple of weeks, twice a month, whatever your field is, and when you get your bonus, whatever, when you get your income, it says you shall not reap your field right up to its edge. You see what that has to do with the margin conversation? He's like, okay, when you get your income, what he's saying to his people, and you can interpret it in 2016 for us, he's saying you don't have to reap all the way to your edge. Do you know why you don't have to reap to the edge? Because in most of our situations, God has given us way more than we need. Can we just admit that for most of us? He's given us way more than we need. And we've assumed, or at least much of my life, I've assumed that the more than I need is for me also. Bonus, God. And some of it is God wants to bless. He pours out blessings. We get more privileges than we should even be allowed. But he doesn't want all of that to be for us. So he tells them, when you reap, don't reap all the way to the edge. Most of us are reaping all the way to the edge, and we're reaping beyond the edge. And he's like, leave some grapes there. Don't strip the vineyards bare. Leave something there so that the poor and the stranger or the sojourner can come and enjoy, because God has given you more than you need. Are you with me? There's a massive just thing that went off in my heart and mind this week, like, wait a minute, God, all that's not for me? It's like, no, Ben, I've given you more than enough so that when people in this community and other places you know around the world, when they have needs, you're going to understand why. Leave some grapes for them. Leave something on the vineyards. Everybody understand? It's an amazing illustration right from the Old Testament for how we can live with financial margin and breathing room in our lives today. That's what he's wanting us to understand. That there's purpose. Financial margin is never an end to itself. It's a means to an end. Let me give you 5 things from Bill Hybels, pastor of Willow Creek Community Church in Chicago. He wrote a book called Simplify. And he gives 5 beliefs in his financial chapter about financial reconciliation. And I think these 5 are huge. I think they reinforce and better spell out everything we've been saying today. Number 1 is this: all I have comes from God. All I have comes from God. Yes, I've worked for some of it, absolutely. I tried to work my best, but I believe that God is the giver of all the good things that he's bestowed upon me. All I have comes from God. Number 2 is, here's the contentment piece: I live joyfully within God's current provision for my life. Some of us are like, can we just blot out the word joyfully and maybe change it with begrudgingly? I live begrudgingly. I will live joyfully within God's current provision for my life. Hybels says in most cases, debt comes from us not living within our current provision and trying to go around God to get more provision. I think it's brilliant. There are other situations, so again, not everyone, but he says that debt, like the heavy debt in our lives, comes from us trying to go around God's current provision and try to ensure other provision that God hasn't given to us in this season. Again, there are cases that are, would be otherwise. Number 3, I honor God by giving the 1/10 of all my earnings to his purposes in the world. That first fruits principle. It's not just any tenth. The 1/10. Tithe shows up in the scriptures before the law. It shows up in the law. Jesus references it as a good thing. No one is ever commended for generosity who gives less than the tithe. In fact, in the scriptures, I think you will only find people commended for generosity that's beyond the tithe. But 10% would be a great place to start. Number 4, here's the margin. I set aside a portion of all my earnings into a savings account or some other account for emergencies, giving opportunities, and my later years. Emergencies, giving opportunities, and my later years. So I establish margin, little or much, whatever, and there's some purposes. And then I love number 5, once we have the margin. I live each day with an open ear toward heaven, eager to respond to any whisper from God regarding my resources. I live with an open ear toward heaven. I've got this margin, so I'm ready to share, right? 1 Timothy 6:18. I'm ready to be generous. I'm ready to share. And God, as you lead me throughout my daily life, show me, and you're not supposed to say yes to every opportunity. Just, can I get that out there? You're not even supposed to say yes to every Jesus expanding kingdom opportunity. Is that okay? Anybody need permission with that? But when God leads you specifically, and you already have that margin, listen to that whisper from him like, Ben, this is something I'm doing. It's something I want you to be a part of. One of the great privileges Shauna and I, and even our boys and our daughter now have entered into is like the privilege of helping strategic ministries, church plants, kids around the world. And it's been amazing just for our kids to grab that at an early age. I love that. And so we live with an open ear toward heaven. So 2 questions as we finish. Number 1, where's your contentment level with Jesus and what he's provided for you in this season? Where's your contentment level? And number 2, what are you doing with what he's entrusted to you? These are for followers of Jesus. If you're just exploring faith, it's not for you this morning. I'll give you something else in a minute. As followers of Jesus, though, where's your contentment? Like, just being honest. Start where you are. And then what are you doing with what he's entrusted to you? Jesus said, for where your treasure is, Matthew 6:21, there your heart will be also. And the more that we treasure Christ, the more we will grow in contentment, and the more we will grow in being strategic with what we do with the extra that God's given us. Friends, I've told you this already, but this has been a hard one for me. I don't think it's because my spending's way out of control, but as I've thought hard about the contentment, as I've thought hard about, Ben, what is enough for you? Not what the church answer is, but what's really enough? And this is not about me going to Shauna and going, hey, date nights are over for the decade. Right? It's not that. God gives us good gifts. He gives us beyond what just we need to be content. So I understand that. But it is about me just going, man, Ben, why does it take so much? Because what discontentment also leads to, or pairs nicely with, or ugly with, is the sense of entitlement. I deserve to do this. I deserve to live that way. I work hard at the church. I should be able to. We need to back away from that and just go, Jesus, help me grow in my contentment. And knowing that my life is short compared to eternity. Help me invest wisely. Yes, that's including retirement. That's including emergencies. But I want to leverage what you've given me for something that's going to way outlast me, that really counts in eternity, to lay up treasure that's a good foundation for the future, to take hold of that. Here's a play on words again. Paul says, take hold of that which is truly life. Many of us have told ourselves, if I can have that, that will really be living. And two things about that. One, it always disappoints if we're holding it up as main thing in our lives. And number two, we will miss out on that which is truly life. Would you pray with me? So much of what we've said this morning is aimed at those of us who are we are followers of Christ, and we're trying to center more of our life around him. But if you're not a Christian, I'm so glad that you're here, and I'm going to speak directly to you in this moment. There's a place in a letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthian church, and he was trying to tell them that they should excel in this act of generosity. They should really succeed in being givers. And he says this, though, about Jesus. He says, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich." That's the only message I want you to hear today. Jesus didn't reap to his edges. He didn't take everything he was entitled to. To be honest, he gave up everything he was entitled to so that you might receive not what you're entitled to, but what he's entitled to. So he pours into you righteousness and mercy and grace and forgiveness of your sins. And if you've never entered into that beautiful relationship, you can this morning just by saying, Jesus, it's amazing to me that you didn't take everything that was rightfully yours. Instead, you were willing to die on the cross and gift me what was rightfully yours. Confess my sin, forgive me. I want to live my life for you. And if that's you, let us know by checking that box on your card so we can follow up with you. And for those of us who are followers of Jesus, it's a penetrating question to ask, but here it is. What do you treasure? Really? What do you treasure? It's not a question we run over quickly. But what do you treasure? What matters most? What must you have at all costs? And let's see if Jesus could build contentment in us and help us to leverage what he's given us for his causes. Would you stand with me as the band leads us in a song about how Jesus is our Savior?